The winter of 1912 had descended upon Montreal with a bitter intensity, a chill that seeped into the bones of every citizen and made the gas lamps flicker uncertainly along the cobblestone streets. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the city in a pristine white layer that seemed almost too perfect, too silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. It was on one such night, in the dead hours before dawn, that the first reports of the shadows began to emerge. At first, they were dismissed as tricks of the weak winter light, illusions cast by flickering lamps or the sway of branches outside windows. But the incidents soon became too frequent, too consistent, and the stories began to spread with a quiet urgency, carried from neighbor to neighbor in hushed whispers that suggested fear, disbelief, and fascination all at once. The earliest accounts came from the narrow streets of Old Montreal, where families had lived for generations and where the gaslight's glow barely penetrated the icy darkness. Residents spoke of fleeting figures that seemed to move independently of anyone controlling them, shadows that lingered just beyond the periphery of vision. Objects were reported to shift inexplicably, chairs overturned, doors left ajar with no sign of a human intruder. One man, a baker whose shopfront faced the main thoroughfare, described seeing a long, black form stretching across the street, only to vanish the moment he summoned the courage to approach. The story was relayed by the local grocer, who had seen the same apparition flicker along his back alley. Each retelling was tinged with the same mixture of terror and disbelief. As the night progressed, the reports became more detailed, more unsettling. Families claimed that shadows would detach themselves from their owners, slinking along walls and across floors as though seeking something unknown. In one affluent home near the river, a governess reported seeing the shadows of her charges moving independently, mimicking the children's actions yet lacking the warmth, the weight, the presence of flesh and bone. Her testimony was met with polite skepticism at first, but similar stories surfaced from neighboring houses, eroding the confidence of the community that these were mere hallucinations. The cumulative effect was a slow, creeping anxiety, a sensation that the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were thinning. Local newspapers, always eager for sensational material, began to publish accounts, though with a careful hand. "Phantoms or folly," one headline read, suggesting doubt while acknowledging the growing public interest. Reporters combed the streets in search of evidence, speaking to witnesses who described the shadows' movements with unnerving precision. Some claimed that the shadows seemed to react to thought, retreating when confronted and advancing when ignored. One particularly vivid account came from a young clerk who described seeing his own shadow linger after he had turned away, its form stretching unnaturally, bending and curling as though imbued with a malevolent intelligence. These descriptions, though varied, shared a common thread: the shadows were not inert, not random, they were intentional, watching, and aware. The psychological weight of these reports began to manifest in the city's inhabitants. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, urging them not to stray too far from home after dusk. Shopkeepers closed their windows at night, even when there was no apparent threat, and travelers hurried through the streets, glancing nervously over their shoulders. The fear was subtle at first, a quiet tension, but it escalated rapidly as more witnesses came forward. People began to question their own senses, wondering whether the shadows were real or figments of their imagination, and yet no one could ignore them entirely. Even the most rational and scientifically minded citizens admitted to an unease that was difficult to articulate but impossible to dismiss. In certain districts, the shadows became almost theatrical in their behavior, manifesting at predictable hours and following peculiar paths through alleyways and along building facades. Some scholars of the time, intrigued by the phenomenon, attempted to document it with sketches and rudimentary photography, but their results were frustratingly inconclusive. The shadows rarely revealed themselves fully to the camera, they were ephemeral, as though existing in a space just beyond the reach of human perception. These failed attempts at capturing evidence only heightened the mystique, creating a sense of anticipation, as though the city itself were participating in a slow, unspoken ritual. As the days passed, the atmosphere in Montreal shifted. Streets that had once been lively and bustling became subdued, as residents curtailed nighttime activity and avoided areas where the shadows had been reported. Social gatherings were replaced by quiet, guarded evenings indoors. The church bells rang with a new solemnity, their tones echoing through neighborhoods where parents and children huddled together, listening for the slightest movement beyond the walls. In private, individuals began to share stories of personal encounters, shadows that reached out, that lingered in corners, that seemed to respond to thought and emotion. Whether these reports were genuine or the product of collective fear was impossible to determine, yet the effect on the populace was real, a city gripped by anxiety, its citizens living in the presence of a silent, watching force. One particularly chilling account came from a night watchman patrolling the docks along the St. Lawrence River. He described seeing long, sinuous forms moving across the water, shadows that were neither reflections nor ordinary silhouettes. As he called for assistance, the forms vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a cold, unnatural silence. His testimony, corroborated by another watchman, became one of the defining narratives of the early phenomenon, establishing the shadows not as fleeting tricks of light but as persistent entities that could not be easily ignored or explained. By the end of the first week, the city had settled into a strange rhythm, each night punctuated by the possibility of encountering these entities. The tension was palpable, a collective holding of breath, a fragile balance between daily routine and underlying terror. Montreal was transformed from a city of commerce and ordinary human interaction into a stage for an unfolding enigma. The shadows, though unseen in most cases, had become characters in the daily life of the city, influencing behavior, shaping perception, and eroding the certainty of what was real. In this opening stage, the audience is introduced to the eerie tone that will permeate the entire narrative, a city of snow and gaslight, a population teetering between disbelief and horror, and an invisible force that challenges the limits of understanding. The story establishes the emotional stakes, the societal context, and the chilling suggestion that what is unseen can be as threatening as what is tangible. Montreal of 1912, once bustling and grounded in reality, is poised on the brink of a psychological and supernatural unraveling, setting the stage for the trials, theories, and mysteries that will follow. Before the shadows began their quiet march through Montreal, the city thrived with an ordinary vibrancy that belied the chilling events to come. In the early months of 1912, streets teemed with horse-drawn carriages, trams rattled along their rails, and shopkeepers arranged their wares with meticulous care. Gas lamps lined the streets in rows, their flickering flames lending a warm glow that softened the cold air and offered a semblance of comfort to those navigating the snow-laden avenues. Montreal was a city in transition, balancing its European architectural heritage with the pressures of industrialization, and its population reflected a mixture of working-class families, skilled artisans, and a burgeoning middle class striving for respectability. The neighborhoods themselves were a study in contrast. The old Montreal district retained cobblestone streets, centuries-old buildings, and a sense of lingering history, where narrow alleyways twisted unpredictably and shadows pooled in corners regardless of the hour. The wealthier areas along the St. Lawrence River showcased grand brick homes, ornate facades, and manicured gardens that seemed impervious to the creeping winter frost. Yet even in these affluent quarters, a tension existed between human order and the natural elements, the icy wind howling through empty streets at night, carrying with it an almost spectral quality that would later feed the city's growing unease. Families and individuals were accustomed to navigating both the physical challenges of winter and the social demands of a modernizing city, unaware that an invisible, psychological threat was quietly looming. Daily life was structured and ritualistic, providing citizens with a framework of certainty that would soon be disrupted. Shops opened and closed with predictable regularity, children attended school in neat uniforms, and factory workers adhered to rigid schedules dictated by the relentless ticking of industrial clocks. Families gathered around modest hearths at night, sharing meals and stories that reinforced community bonds. These routines fostered a sense of stability, a belief that the world was orderly and predictable. It was precisely this sense of normalcy that the shadows would later exploit, creating an emotional dissonance that magnified fear, as the citizens' expectations of safety and rationality were gradually eroded. Montreal's cultural and social life also played a crucial role in setting the stage for the events of that winter. Religious institutions were central to the community, providing moral guidance, social support, and a framework for understanding misfortune. The clergy preached from the pulpit, emphasizing discipline, obedience, and the importance of faith. At the same time, the city's newspapers were flourishing, delivering local and international news with a growing sense of immediacy, and journalists cultivated a readership eager for both informative reporting and sensational accounts. It was within this mix of faith, intellect, and curiosity that the first seeds of doubt and fascination were planted, as people struggled to reconcile reason with the inexplicable. The architectural environment contributed to the city's atmospheric tension. Narrow alleyways, high brick walls, and intricate ironwork created pockets of shadow even on sunny days. Gas lamps flickered in a bitter wind, casting elongated silhouettes that seemed to move with a life of their own. Within these physical confines, imagination and perception blurred, and subtle distortions in light and space were sufficient to ignite a creeping anxiety in the minds of observers. This setting, both beautiful and claustrophobic, was primed for the psychological intrusion of the shadows. Residents' awareness of these physical spaces, hallways, stairwells, backyards, would later be manipulated by the phenomenon, turning the familiar into a source of suspense and dread. The human element was equally crucial. Families were tightly knit, with generations living under the same roof or in adjacent homes, sharing in daily routines and social obligations. Children were taught to respect both authority and superstition, absorbing lessons about saints, spirits, and the unseen forces that might influence their lives. Neighbors maintained a cautious familiarity, greeting one another politely but never overstepping social boundaries. This combination of intimacy and distance created a network in which rumors could spread quickly while personal skepticism remained deeply entrenched. When the shadows appeared, these social bonds would act as both amplifiers and barriers, spreading panic yet also fostering disbelief in those who clung to reason. Commerce and industry further defined the rhythm of life in Montreal. Marketplaces were crowded, merchants hawked their goods with practiced calls, and the hum of labor in factories and shipyards provided a soundtrack of productivity and progress. Yet even in these centers of human activity, winter imposed its constraints, snow blocked streets, icy winds slowed the delivery of goods, and workers faced the daily struggle of exposure to the cold. These environmental pressures, while mundane, primed the population for heightened vigilance. When the shadows began to intrude upon the daily rhythm, the disruption felt both extraordinary and deeply threatening because it interfered with an otherwise familiar and structured existence. Intellectually, Montreal was a city engaged in debates over science, philosophy, and the supernatural. Educated citizens followed discoveries in psychology, physics, and natural history, often juxtaposing rational inquiry with lingering belief in omens, spirits, and mystical phenomena. Public lectures, literary salons, and social clubs fostered discussion and debate, creating a climate in which curiosity and skepticism coexisted uneasily. This duality would later shape the city's response to the shadows, as some sought scientific explanations while others turned to folklore or religious interpretation. The tension between reason and belief became a defining characteristic of the unfolding mystery. The city's population was also intimately aware of mortality, disease, and the fragility of life. Seasonal influenza, industrial accidents, and winter hazards made survival a daily concern. Families developed routines for safety, health, and precaution, instilling a sense of caution that bordered on hyper-awareness. When the shadows began to manifest, these pre-existing anxieties were heightened, creating fertile ground for fear to grow unchecked. Ordinary vigilance, previously a form of prudence, became a psychological trap, as every movement in the dark streets or flicker of light indoors was interpreted as potentially threatening. By the final days before the shadows fully claimed the city's attention, Montreal was a place of contrasts, vibrant yet restrained, familiar yet full of hidden angles and secret recesses, rational yet steeped in superstition. The streets, the families, the social and intellectual structures all contributed to a delicate equilibrium. It was precisely this equilibrium, this fragile sense of security and order, that would be challenged, eroded, and ultimately shattered. The city, though unaware, was already poised on the threshold of a psychological and supernatural unraveling, ready to experience a winter that would forever change the way its citizens perceived the ordinary, the unseen, and the boundaries of human understanding. The first signs of the extraordinary in Montreal were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they quickly accumulated into an atmosphere of unease that could not be ignored. Initially, it was small things, a candle flickering for no apparent reason, a fleeting shadow darting across a hallway, the sensation of being observed where no one should be. At first, citizens dismissed these occurrences as products of fatigue, stress, or imagination. The long winter nights were harsh, the snow reflecting the dim gaslight in ways that played tricks on the eye, and the minds of observers were already primed to see the unusual. Yet as the days passed, the anomalies increased in frequency and intensity, and patterns began to emerge. People could no longer write them off as coincidence. Families in the old Montreal district were among the earliest to report these strange happenings. One merchant recounted returning home to find his front door slightly ajar, despite having locked it securely that morning. Inside, shadows appeared to move independently of their owners, stretching and shrinking as if following some unseen rhythm. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken presence, creating a sensation of confinement that contrasted with the city's open streets. Children whispered about seeing shapes lingering near corners, their imaginations initially dismissed by parents who later found themselves wondering whether the tales were more than simple fantasy. Fear began to seep quietly into domestic life, subtle at first, growing heavier with each unexplained occurrence. In the narrow alleys and backstreets, the phenomena took on an almost sentient quality. Residents reported glimpsing forms that seemed to follow them, remaining just beyond direct sight. A young clerk described walking home from work and sensing a presence behind him. When he turned, nothing was there, but he felt an unmistakable pressure, a silent acknowledgement of his movement. Similar reports emerged from neighboring streets, each account adding layers to a collective understanding that the city was under observation by something that could not be explained. Even those who prided themselves on rationality began to question their perceptions, caught between disbelief and the undeniable impressions left by repeated encounters. Local newspapers, sensing a story that could capture the public imagination, began to document the incidents. Their coverage was cautious, often framed in skeptical terms, but they provided a platform for eyewitnesses to share their experiences. One particularly chilling report detailed a man who awoke to find his own shadow cast on the opposite wall, moving independently from his body. The story noted that the figure mimicked his gestures with a precision that was unnerving, pausing when he paused, extending and bending in unnatural ways. Readers were captivated and alarmed, and letters to editors soon reflected the growing anxiety of citizens who were beginning to recognize similar phenomena in their own homes. Psychologists and early scholars of human behavior were intrigued by the reports but offered little comfort. Some argued that the shadows were a manifestation of mass suggestion, a form of collective hysteria intensified by the long, isolating winter nights. Others suggested that sleep deprivation, stress, and fear were interacting to produce vivid hallucinations, while a smaller group of thinkers hinted at forces beyond the reach of conventional understanding. These debates, though academic, trickled down into households and cafes, adding both intellectual curiosity and a deeper layer of anxiety to the city's experience. People were now aware that the events were being noticed by observers outside their immediate social circles, creating a sense of validation that was both reassuring and terrifying. The tension between skepticism and fear was further complicated by religious interpretations. Clergy members preached caution and moral vigilance, suggesting that the shadows could be manifestations of spiritual imbalance or even malevolent forces testing the city. Devout citizens responded with prayers, blessings, and rituals, seeking protection for themselves and their families. Others, however, viewed these actions with a mixture of doubt and unease, fearing that the interventions might be insufficient or even provoke the very entities they sought to repel. The interplay between faith and fear intensified the psychological weight of the phenomena, making ordinary spaces, bedrooms, kitchens, street corners, charged with symbolic significance. Witnesses began to report that the shadows were not passive. Some described them as reacting to emotions, retreating in the face of anger or courage, advancing when one was fearful or hesitant. In one account, a young girl's shadow seemed to curl around her mother as she slept, a protective yet alien presence that both comforted and terrified. Neighbors observed shadows interacting with each other, converging and separating in patterns that suggested intelligence or intention. These observations, when combined, painted a picture of something that defied conventional laws of physics and psychology, a force that existed in the liminal space between reality and perception. As the days progressed, the frequency of encounters increased. Shopkeepers noticed objects slightly displaced, footprints in fresh snow that did not belong to anyone, and windows fogged from unexplained drafts. People walking through the city felt eyes upon them even when no one was visible. Public spaces, once bustling and ordinary, acquired a heightened tension. Each pedestrian, each passing carriage, seemed to cast long, spectral echoes in the imagination of onlookers. Rumors proliferated rapidly, carried by the city's dense population, fueling both caution and curiosity. Citizens spoke in hushed tones of the watching ones, or the spirits in the streets, creating folklore in real time, woven from observation, imagination, and fear. By the end of the third week, Montreal had reached a collective state of vigilance bordering on paranoia. Families double-checked locks, children were kept indoors, and the elderly spoke of shadows from past generations that were never so bold or persistent. The city, once confident in its rational order, was becoming a landscape of anxiety, with every corner and alley a potential site of the unknown. Sleep became elusive, conversations were tinged with unease, and the tension was palpable even in daylight hours. The shadows had begun to reshape the emotional and social terrain, asserting their presence not through overt violence but through subtle, pervasive psychological influence. The whispers of the unseen, though often dismissed by authorities and skeptics, marked a turning point in the unfolding story. The phenomenon was no longer a series of isolated incidents, it had become a shared experience, binding citizens together in fear and fascination. As attention shifted from individual reports to the citywide pattern, Montreal stood at the threshold of a winter unlike any before. The ordinary rhythm of life, the familiar structures of home, work, and social interaction, were now overshadowed, literally and metaphorically, by a force that challenged perception, reason, and belief. The stage was set for the coming escalation, as whispers of the unseen began to coalesce into a full-blown urban enigma that would grip the hearts and minds of every citizen it touched. As the shadows continued their silent, unsettling presence across Montreal, the city began to shift from cautious observation to whispered suspicion. The first accusations emerged not in courts or official channels, but in the homes and alleys where ordinary citizens had grown increasingly aware of the inexplicable. Neighbors began questioning one another, asking in hushed tones who might have caused the strange occurrences or what unseen force could be responsible. At first, these conversations were tentative, a mixture of fear and incredulity, yet over days and weeks, the pattern of accusation took shape. Shadows were no longer simply eerie phenomena, they became entities that required explanation, judgment, and blame. In families across the city, tension rose as parents and children struggled to understand the events unfolding around them. Some attributed the phenomena to mischievous spirits or restless souls, remnants of past lives unsettled by the modern city's growth and noise. Others suspected that neighbors with grudges or hidden malice were somehow controlling the shadows, manipulating the darkness for personal gain or revenge. These suspicions were subtle at first, a glance too long, a remark misunderstood, but they quickly escalated into overt confrontation. A grocer accused a rival shopkeeper of sending the shadows to harass his store. A maid was suspected of dark enchantments when objects in her employer's house seemed to move of their own accord. The city's social fabric, previously tight-knit and governed by polite civility, began to fray under the pressure of fear and doubt. Religious leaders were among the first to frame the accusations in moral and spiritual terms. Sermons from local churches began to speak of unseen forces, of divine retribution, and of the human propensity to invite evil through negligence or sin. Parishioners listened intently, many seeking comfort and guidance in the words of clergy, while others felt a rising anxiety as the interpretations grew increasingly literal and punitive. The idea that shadows could be manifestations of moral failing spread quickly, and individuals began to question their own conduct as potential catalysts for the disturbances. Families prayed with greater intensity, performing nightly rituals in hopes of warding off whatever forces had been unleashed, yet the shadows seemed indifferent, appearing in homes where faith and devotion were strongest. The role of newspapers and local media further fueled the wave of accusations. Journalists reported on witness testimonies, often highlighting the drama and fear inherent in the stories. Headlines hinted at scandal, and letters to editors detailed suspicions of wrongdoing, sometimes naming individuals or households. In cafes and marketplaces, conversations turned to speculation about who, or what, was responsible. Some citizens began to associate the shadows with recent conflicts, small disputes, or rivalries, drawing tenuous connections that seemed convincing only because of the pervasive anxiety gripping the population. Even those skeptical of supernatural explanations found themselves drawn into the swirl of suspicion, as the pressure to identify a cause became overwhelming. Public spaces became arenas for confrontation. In streets and squares, groups of citizens would gather to share sightings, exchange theories, and debate the credibility of reports. Accusations were voiced more openly, often directed at the marginalized or those who lived alone, vulnerable to suspicion simply because they were different. A recluse living near the riverfront was accused of summoning shadows through secret rituals. A young couple was suspected of attracting the entities through impropriety or carelessness. Social tensions rose, and in some cases, verbal altercations turned physical. The once orderly city was beginning to fracture, its population divided between fear-driven accusatory factions and those still clinging to reason. Legal authorities found themselves unprepared for the unique nature of the accusations. Police officers and magistrates attempted to investigate claims, but the lack of tangible evidence rendered conventional procedures nearly useless. Witnesses offered conflicting accounts, shadows appeared in unpredictable patterns, and the phenomenon seemed to defy rational explanation. Authorities were caught between public pressure to act and the impossibility of finding a culprit. This tension only amplified public anxiety, as citizens interpreted the lack of resolution as confirmation that the shadows were intentional, possibly even controlled by someone with malevolent skill or knowledge. Even domestic servants and employees were not immune. Reports surfaced of maids, butlers, and clerks being accused of manipulating household shadows for personal reasons, whether to provoke fear, exact revenge, or satisfy hidden desires. In many cases, these accusations were fueled by minor conflicts or misunderstandings that, under the weight of anxiety, became amplified into serious allegations. Families turned inward, suspicion replacing trust, as each unexplained movement or shifted object became evidence of intentional wrongdoing. In this environment, rational explanations were increasingly dismissed, replaced by narratives of malice, magic, or divine punishment. The psychological toll was profound. Anxiety became pervasive, disrupting sleep, concentration, and social cohesion. Children awoke screaming at shadows that no one else could see, adults reported sudden chills and a constant sense of being watched. Accusations, once whispered, became almost ritualized, a way to impose a semblance of control over an uncontrollable situation. Naming a suspect, even arbitrarily, offered a temporary emotional relief, a mechanism for reducing fear by channeling it into anger or blame. Yet this strategy often backfired, intensifying conflict and paranoia and creating a feedback loop in which the shadow's presence seemed increasingly directed and purposeful. At the same time, folklore and superstition blended with reality. Stories of past hauntings, spirits, and demonic visitations resurfaced, often modified to fit contemporary events. The citizens of Montreal, drawing upon cultural memory and inherited beliefs, began to perceive the shadows as extensions of old moral and spiritual codes. In this context, accusations took on a moral weight. The shadows were agents of justice or punishment, and those suspected were potentially complicit, deserving scrutiny or correction. The interplay between fear, cultural narrative, and social dynamics deepened the intensity of suspicion, creating an environment where the unseen became inseparable from the social imagination. By the end of the first month, the first accusations had firmly established a new reality in Montreal. Shadows were no longer neutral phenomena, they were imbued with intent, agency, and moral significance. Individuals, families, and entire neighborhoods became entangled in a complex web of fear, suspicion, and social policing. Rationality struggled to maintain its foothold, while superstition, rumor, and anecdote gained power. The city, once confident in its order and reason, had begun to fracture under the combined pressures of the invisible and the accusatory. Trust between neighbors had eroded, faith in institutions was tested, and the stage was set for an escalation that would transform fear into official scrutiny, and rumor into a public spectacle. The first accusations were, in essence, a turning point. They marked the moment when the city collectively acknowledged the shadows not just as phenomena but as active agents demanding recognition, judgment, and response. The narrative of the unseen had moved from the private realm of observation to the social and moral sphere, setting the groundwork for events that would involve courts, witnesses, and the surreal spectacle of a trial unlike any other. Montreal, gripped by fear and uncertainty, was now poised on the threshold of a confrontation that would redefine its understanding of reality, morality, and the boundaries of the visible world. As reports of shadows and the first accusations circulated through Montreal, the city's authorities, newspapers, and religious leaders initially attempted to maintain a veneer of normalcy. Officials insisted that the phenomena were exaggerated, the products of overactive imaginations or winter-induced fatigue. Newspapers published editorials cautioning readers against credulity, and magistrates assured the public that no legal framework existed to prosecute such vague disturbances. Clergy encouraged calm, framing the events as tests of faith rather than evidence of supernatural malevolence. Despite these efforts, the denials only served to heighten tension, for the public could not ignore what they had seen, felt, or feared. Ordinary citizens, who had experienced the anomalies firsthand, began to interpret institutional dismissal as indifference, or even complicity, fanning the flames of anxiety. At first, the denials were subtle, a careful balancing act between maintaining public confidence and avoiding panic. City officials issued statements assuring residents that the streets were safe, that reports of shadows were anecdotal, and that citizens should not give in to hysteria. Newspapers ran skeptical columns, offering rational explanations, shifting light, reflections in snow, or natural drafts causing objects to move. Clergy spoke of the devil's work metaphorically, suggesting that human sinfulness, not a literal shadow presence, accounted for the unrest. Yet the more the authorities denied the reality of the phenomena, the more citizens felt the gap between their lived experience and public pronouncements, a gap that bred distrust and suspicion. As the shadows persisted and encounters became increasingly vivid, denial began to feel like a lie to those affected. Parents reported objects moving while children slept, merchants observed shapes in alleyways at night, and workers returning from late shifts claimed to be followed by intangible forms. Skeptics and authorities could not replicate or disprove the phenomena, leaving ordinary people to reconcile their own observations with official statements. This disconnect created fertile ground for moral panic. Anxiety spread not only because the shadows were inexplicable, but because the institutions designed to provide order and protection appeared incapable of addressing them. Neighborhoods reacted in subtle and overt ways. Citizens began implementing personal precautions, double-checking doors and windows, avoiding streets where shadows were most frequently reported, and limiting social gatherings after dark. Families altered their routines, moving cautiously through homes and streets, speaking in lowered voices, and watching one another for signs of strange behavior. In public spaces, crowds whispered of sightings, and rumor became a powerful tool, both warning and inflaming. Small incidents, previously insignificant, were magnified through collective attention. A flickering lantern, a shifting curtain, a long shadow on the pavement became proof of an omnipresent, watchful force. The moral panic extended into commerce and public life. Shopkeepers reported declining evening trade as customers avoided the streets, fearing shadows might strike or haunt them. Public gatherings grew tense, with conversations dominated by reports of sightings, personal encounters, and speculation about the entity's intentions. Even children became participants in the growing anxiety, repeating stories they had heard from parents or older siblings, embellishing details in ways that lent the phenomenon both narrative depth and emotional resonance. Montreal became a city where suspicion and fear infiltrated daily life, subtly reshaping social interactions, patterns of movement, and the perception of familiar spaces. Religious interpretation intensified the moral dimension of the panic. Sermons warned of unseen forces punishing human sin or testing communal faith. Parishioners were urged to reflect on morality, to confess wrongdoings, and to perform protective rituals. The presence of shadows was framed not simply as a threat to safety, but as a reflection of moral order, a judgment of human behavior. Faith became both a source of comfort and a vector for anxiety, as citizens worried that any lapse in piety or moral vigilance might invite further disturbances. Spiritual explanations clashed with rational denial, producing an emotional tension that heightened the city's collective fear. Medical professionals and early psychologists attempted to weigh in, though their voices were often drowned out by the cacophony of anecdotal reports and institutional skepticism. Some posited that fatigue, stress, and social contagion accounted for the observations. Others suggested hysteria or mass suggestion, noting that when one family or neighborhood began to report shadows, nearby districts often followed. While these analyses provided a framework for understanding, they did little to assuage the palpable terror of individuals who experienced tangible, inexplicable phenomena firsthand. The contrast between lived experience and rational explanation became a central source of tension, feeding both mistrust and panic. The city's youth were particularly affected. Children were warned to avoid certain streets, discouraged from leaving the house after dark, and told stories of shadows that punished disobedience. Playground games were replaced by whispered discussions of sightings, and peer interactions became tinged with fear and superstition. Adolescents, caught between skepticism and the desire to conform to social narratives, sometimes fabricated sightings or exaggerated encounters, further inflating the sense of omnipresent threat. The moral panic, therefore, was not solely the product of adult anxiety, it filtered through generations, embedding itself into the collective consciousness of Montreal's population. By the end of the second month of shadow sightings, the city had entered a state of heightened alertness bordering on hysteria. Families patrolled their homes at night, workers avoided evening streets, and conversations everywhere, from markets to public squares, revolved around fear of the unseen. Skeptics were silenced not by logic but by the overwhelming emotional weight of shared dread. Institutional denial had failed, unable to bridge the gap between official rationality and lived experience. The shadows, though still invisible to most, had succeeded in asserting influence over behavior, reshaping daily life, and embedding themselves in the collective psyche. The denial by authorities and clergy, intended to preserve calm, instead amplified the psychological tension. Citizens interpreted inaction as evidence of incompetence or complicity, prompting informal social policing and a proliferation of private protective measures. The shadows, whether real or imagined, became catalysts for moral scrutiny, social division, and widespread anxiety. Montreal was no longer merely a city under winter's grip, it was a city psychologically besieged, each resident balancing rational understanding against instinctual fear, caught in the liminal space between denial and acknowledgement, logic and superstition. Public denial had thus unintentionally laid the groundwork for a moral panic that would soon demand formal recognition and confrontation. The stage was set for escalating fear to intersect with law, religion, and social structure, a convergence that would ultimately manifest in a spectacle both surreal and historically unprecedented. Montreal's population had been transformed, the city itself had become a theater of anticipation, a place where the unseen commanded attention, and where human institutions struggled, and often failed, to contain the force of collective anxiety. As Montreal's fear of the shadows escalated, the city reached a point where private suspicion transformed into a public spectacle, an unprecedented confrontation with the unknown. Citizens, desperate for answers and justice, clamored for some form of accountability, and the idea of a trial emerged. What was extraordinary, and later recounted with a mix of awe and disbelief, was that the trial was not intended for humans. The accused were the shadows themselves, or rather, representations of them. Legal authorities, struggling to reconcile the absence of tangible perpetrators with the intensity of public anxiety, sought a way to confront the phenomenon formally. The city, caught between law, morality, and fear, attempted to assert control over what could not be controlled. The initial proposals for the trial were met with skepticism from judges, lawyers, and scholars. How could one prosecute a shadow? How could a court of law confront an entity that defied measurement, observation, or definition? Despite these intellectual challenges, the populace demanded action. To calm public unrest, the municipal authorities devised a symbolic process. Objects associated with the shadows, faded curtains, overturned chairs, footprints in snow, and other evidence of disturbance, were gathered as material proxies. Witnesses were called to describe the shadow's behavior in detail, their accounts treated as testimony, even though the entity itself could not appear in court. The scene was surreal, a theater of the absurd, yet underpinned by genuine civic and psychological urgency. The courtroom was transformed into a stage of suspense and tension. Local magistrates, officials, and clerks filled seats alongside anxious spectators. Families who had experienced shadow encounters arrived in hopes of seeing justice done. Witnesses recounted experiences with precise emotion, describing forms that moved independently, objects displaced, and the oppressive sensation of being watched. Some recounted frightening interactions, shadows that mimicked gestures, curled around children's beds, or lingered near windows at night. Each story built upon the previous, weaving a narrative of intelligence, intent, and near malevolence. Though the accused were intangible, the impact was tangible. The trial offered a public space for the city's collective fear to be articulated and validated. Legal proceedings were both formal and improvisational. Lawyers attempted to structure arguments, discussing culpability, intent, and evidence, even as all were confronted with the limits of tangible proof. Witness testimony dominated, with careful attention to detail and emotional resonance. Magistrates posed questions, seeking patterns or rational explanations, but the witnesses' accounts remained maddeningly inconsistent. Some described shadows behaving with deliberate cunning, others emphasized randomness and unpredictability. The contradictions did not diminish the perceived threat, instead, they heightened anxiety, illustrating the shadow's apparent ability to defy logic and evade comprehension. The trial quickly took on a ritualistic quality. Objects associated with shadow activity were displayed in the center of the courtroom. Chairs overturned in homes were placed before the magistrates, curtains that had moved inexplicably were hung as evidence, and sketches made by observers were presented, attempting to give the intangible some form of presence. Each exhibit became a focal point for the witness's testimony, reinforcing the reality of the phenomenon even as it eluded conventional legal scrutiny. The citizens watching the proceedings were both participants and audience, experiencing the tension of the courtroom as a shared, almost theatrical, confrontation with the unknown. Religious leaders contributed to the trial's emotional weight. Priests and pastors offered interpretations of the shadow's presence as moral or spiritual phenomena, asserting that the court's recognition of evidence, no matter how abstract, was necessary to restore balance between the city and unseen forces. Blessings were performed, prayers recited, and symbolic gestures enacted to underscore the seriousness of the proceedings. For citizens steeped in faith, these acts lent legitimacy to the otherwise absurd spectacle, bridging the gap between rational law and supernatural interpretation. The courtroom became a hybrid space, part judicial institution, part theater, part religious ritual, all suffused with tension, dread, and anticipation. Witnesses varied in credibility, yet each account added to the cumulative effect of fear. Children testified about shadows crawling along bedroom walls, shopkeepers recounted figures gliding along alleyways, leaving no footprints, housewives described feeling invisible fingers brushing against furniture or the subtle cold of a presence passing near them. Each story reinforced the others, creating a collective narrative that the city had both experienced and observed. The court's challenge was not to determine guilt in a conventional sense, but to document, acknowledge, and symbolically confront a threat that could not be captured by evidence, locked in a paradox between legal procedure and existential fear. Despite the trial's symbolic nature, the emotional intensity was real. Witnesses broke down, spectators gasped, and the court itself seemed to hum with the palpable tension of collective anxiety. The act of naming, describing, and confronting the shadows provided psychological relief even as it heightened the surrealism of the situation. Citizens felt that some form of justice was being enacted, though it was a justice without a tangible defendant, without punishment in the traditional sense. The trial existed to validate fear, establish narrative control, and offer a structured framework for understanding what had otherwise been incomprehensible. The trial's outcomes were ambiguous. No human was convicted, no shadow punished in a material sense, and yet the ceremony of confrontation created a temporary cessation of panic. The act of naming, recording, and formalizing testimony allowed citizens to regain a measure of control over their environment. The courtroom became a symbolic battlefield between fear and order, between the tangible and the invisible, between rationality and imagination. Montreal's population, though unsettled, began to perceive that the phenomenon had been publicly acknowledged, even if not solved, and this acknowledgement created the foundation for the next stage of investigation, reflection, and rumor. By the end of the proceedings, the trial had become more than a legal formality. It was an event that entered the city's collective memory, a testament to the length society will go to confront fear, even when the adversary cannot be seen. The courtroom, the witnesses, the objects, and the rituals together formed a tableau of psychological, social, and cultural significance. Montreal had staged a confrontation not just with shadows, but with uncertainty itself, attempting to impose order on chaos through the tools available: observation, testimony, and ceremony. The trial, though never really a trial, in conventional terms, solidified the city's engagement with the phenomenon, leaving a lasting imprint on public consciousness and setting the stage for scientific inquiry, further fear, and the deepening mystery that would define the city's winter. Following the unprecedented courtroom spectacle, Montreal became a magnet for scholars, intellectuals, and early psychologists who sought to investigate the shadow phenomena with rational scrutiny. Universities and private investigators dispatched letters, proposals, and research teams to the city, eager to understand what defied the boundaries of conventional knowledge. Their arrival injected a new layer of tension into the city's atmosphere, hope that logic and observation might clarify the unknown, and fear that their presence would somehow provoke or attract further disturbances. These experts represented reason in a landscape dominated by uncertainty, yet even their methods struggled to contain a force that seemed entirely resistant to empirical measurement. The initial investigations were cautious and meticulous. Researchers examined the streets where shadows had been most frequently reported, documenting environmental conditions, patterns of light and reflection, and witness testimonies. They studied the architecture of the city, noting the narrow alleys, the high walls, and the intricate ironwork that might influence perception. Early photographs were taken, sketches made, and notes meticulously recorded, yet the shadows proved elusive. In some cases, they appeared briefly in the peripheral vision of the investigators, only to vanish when focus was applied. Objects that were supposedly displaced by shadows in private homes were often found in different positions upon inspection, leading to debates over whether the anomalies were natural, psychological, or supernatural in origin. Psychologists attempted to analyze the city's collective response. They observed the interactions between witnesses and their neighbors, studying how fear spread and how stories of shadows were embellished or altered in retelling. Some argued that mass hysteria could account for the majority of sightings, suggesting that prolonged anxiety, winter isolation, and social contagion created a shared perception of phenomena that did not exist independently. They noted patterns. Areas with the highest density of fearful reporting correlated with the most intense rumor circulation, and witnesses' descriptions often converged after repeated discussion. Yet even the most rigorous analysis could not account for all occurrences, particularly those documented in supposedly controlled environments, leaving open the unsettling possibility that some force defied conventional explanation. Physicists and natural scientists explored environmental causes. They examined unusual light refractions, optical illusions, and subtle temperature differentials in homes and streets. Some hypothesized that unique combinations of snow, gaslight, and architecture created visual distortions, while others considered atmospheric phenomena as contributing factors. These studies provided partial explanations for some sightings but failed to address the accounts in which shadows appeared to move independently of any light source, or the reports of sensations of being watched. The empirical tools of science, precise and methodical, encountered limits that provoked both fascination and frustration among the experts, emphasizing the shadow's resistance to conventional categorization. Folklorists and historians contributed a complementary perspective. They explored Montreal's past, cataloging previous reports of ghostly activity, supernatural encounters, and moralistic tales of punishment through invisible agents. Stories of spirits attached to certain families, unquiet souls wandering streets at night, and urban legends of unseen watchers were compared to current events. Folklorists noted remarkable similarities, suggesting that cultural memory and inherited narratives might influence perception, amplifying ordinary events into phenomena interpreted as extraordinary. These analyses did not dismiss the reports entirely, instead framing them within a broader understanding of human psychology, tradition, and the interplay between environment and imagination. Religious scholars and moral philosophers debated the significance of the shadows. Some argued that the city's fear was a reflection of spiritual imbalance, a manifestation of collective guilt or sin. Others contended that the shadows were warnings, symbolic reminders of the fragility of social cohesion and moral order. Public lectures were held, attracting curious citizens eager for answers. The line between reasoned analysis and philosophical interpretation blurred, as the phenomena were at once psychological, physical, and moral in their implications. Montreal became a laboratory not only for empirical study but for reflection on the nature of fear, perception, and human belief. Among the various theories, some were particularly chilling. Certain psychologists proposed that the shadows represented projections of repressed anxieties, taking visible form only under conditions of extreme collective stress. Physicists speculated about unknown forces, energy fields, or unexplained electromagnetic effects that might interact with human perception. Folklorists suggested echoes of ancestral spirits, carrying moral or social warnings from the past. Each theory, while compelling in isolation, contradicted or complemented others, creating an intricate tapestry of potential explanations that simultaneously comforted, confused, and unnerved. The multiplicity of plausible, yet incomplete, explanations contributed to the city's ongoing fascination and dread. Witness cooperation was essential for the scholarly investigations, and yet it introduced its own challenges. Many citizens were eager to participate, providing detailed accounts, locations, and even demonstrations of where shadows had appeared. Others were wary, fearful that recounting experiences would provoke further activity or expose them to ridicule. Children, in particular, became key informants, their testimonies treated with both skepticism and extraordinary attention due to their perceived purity of perception. Adults were often surprised to find that children's observations aligned with, yet subtly differed from, their own experiences, highlighting the subjective complexity of the phenomenon and further complicating the process of empirical investigation. By the end of the third month of academic scrutiny, Montreal had become a nexus of study, drawing scholars from across the region. Laboratories, lecture halls, and private homes were converted into spaces for observation, experiment, and analysis. The city itself was transformed into a living case study, each street, alley, and home providing data points for ongoing research. Yet despite the growing body of documentation, the shadows remained elusive, resistant to definitive capture, and able to evade both empirical scrutiny and rational understanding. The experts' presence, rather than resolving the mystery, intensified the city's awareness of the unknown, reinforcing both fear and fascination. In this stage, the narrative shifted from fear-driven hysteria to a combination of inquiry and awe. The city's engagement with scholars and theorists created a dialectic between reason and experience, skepticism and belief, science and superstition. Montreal was not merely a backdrop for fear, it was an active participant in the unfolding mystery, its physical and social environments shaping and amplifying the phenomenon. The theories, debates, and investigations became a central narrative element, illustrating both humanity's desire to understand and its limitations when confronting the intangible. The shadows, still unseen in conventional terms, had asserted dominance not through violence but through their capacity to evade understanding, provoking both intellectual engagement and psychological unease. As Montreal moved deeper into winter, the shadow's presence intensified, and with it came a growing sense of isolation among the city's residents. Streets that had once thrived with social and commercial activity became quieter, subdued by the pervasive fear of encountering the unseen. Citizens altered their routines, avoiding familiar routes and public spaces, and families limited movement after dusk. The psychological grip of the shadows manifested in subtle yet profound ways. Friends hesitated to visit one another, neighbors no longer congregated in marketplaces, and even simple acts of daily life, walking to the corner store, collecting mail, or tending to children, were fraught with unease. The city's vibrancy diminished, replaced by a heavy, almost oppressive tension, as the population adapted to a world in which unseen observers seemed to watch and influence behavior. Isolation became both a defensive strategy and a symptom of escalating paranoia. Families reinforced their homes with locked doors, shutters, and makeshift barriers, seeking to create a sense of control in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. Parents monitored children with heightened vigilance, sometimes restricting their movement entirely. Social gatherings, previously a source of comfort and community, were minimized or abandoned altogether. Citizens reported that the shadows seemed to target moments of vulnerability, when individuals were alone, when streets were empty, or when attention was diverted by routine tasks. This perception, whether objective or psychological, reinforced the instinct to isolate, creating an environment in which fear perpetuated itself. The isolation extended beyond the individual to entire neighborhoods. Certain streets became virtually deserted after dark, with only the occasional carriage or hurried pedestrian breaking the silence. Alleyways that had once offered shortcuts now inspired dread, and the city's intricate network of passageways, stairwells, and corridors became landscapes of apprehension. Those who ventured out at night reported feeling followed, observed, or subtly manipulated by forces they could neither see nor quantify. The city itself seemed to contract under the weight of collective anxiety, its social and physical structures bending to accommodate the omnipresent but intangible threat. Reports of more pronounced shadow activity emerged during this period. Witnesses described shadows detaching from walls and furniture, moving independently across rooms and streets, and coalescing into forms that suggested purpose and intelligence. Children reported figures that hovered near beds, retreating when confronted with defiance but lingering when fear was expressed. Adults observed shapes that interacted with the environment in ways that defied physics. Chairs shifted without contact, doors closed gently yet decisively, and footprints appeared on surfaces where no human or animal had traversed. These accounts, increasingly corroborated by multiple observers, reinforced the sense that the shadows were more than figments of imagination, they were active agents, manipulating space, perception, and emotion. The city's intellectual community attempted to respond, but the very isolation imposed by fear hindered collective investigation. Scholars, psychologists, and scientists were constrained by the unwillingness of citizens to participate fully, leaving many observations incomplete or anecdotal. Even those willing to engage cautiously found that the phenomenon resisted replication or prediction. The shadow's apparent selectivity, appearing in some homes but not others, responding to emotion, and retreating from confrontation, complicated attempts to classify or study them. Isolation, while a protective instinct, had inadvertently transformed the city into a fragmented case study, with each household experiencing a version of the phenomenon that was difficult to reconcile with others. The psychological consequences of isolation were profound. Anxiety became chronic, sleep was disrupted, and the boundaries between perception and imagination blurred. Citizens reported feelings of dislocation and disorientation, as if the shadows had extended their influence into mental and emotional space. Children exhibited heightened sensitivity, sometimes refusing to leave rooms or interact with others, while adults experienced intense stress, irritability, and a sense of foreboding that persisted even in daylight hours. The city's social fabric, once woven through trust, interaction, and routine, was unraveling under the combined weight of fear and isolation. Communal institutions struggled to maintain cohesion. Schools implemented limited hours, religious gatherings were curtailed, and public services operated under constrained conditions. Citizens who once relied on civic structures for stability now found those systems inadequate, reinforcing self-reliance and caution. Informal networks emerged, relying on word of mouth and discreet observation to share warnings and guidance, yet these networks were limited in scope and sometimes contributed to misinformation or heightened anxiety. The city's collective experience became a patchwork of isolated pockets, each negotiating its own understanding of the shadows while attempting to maintain a semblance of ordinary life. Rumors intensified during this period, transforming isolation into a conduit for narrative expansion. Accounts of people vanishing, homes abandoned, and entire blocks left empty circulated widely, whether verified or not. Some stories described shadows that lured individuals away from safety, guiding them into alleys or unoccupied buildings from which they never returned. Others recounted families who sealed themselves indoors, only to find that objects, sounds, or impressions of presence intruded into even the most secure spaces. These narratives, while often anecdotal, became accepted as plausible within the climate of fear, reinforcing the perception that the shadows could extend influence beyond immediate visibility. The city's experience reached what would later be termed the vanishing point, a metaphorical and literal threshold in which the ordinary world appeared to erode under the shadow's influence. Citizens reported that streets seemed narrower, familiar routes felt disorienting, and landmarks appeared subtly altered or obscured. The perception of distance and space became unreliable, feeding the sense of invisibility and uncertainty. Social connections weakened as people avoided one another, retreating further into private spaces where the shadow's presence was still keenly felt. The vanishing point represented both psychological collapse and environmental transformation, a stage in which the ordinary markers of life, streets, homes, routines, and relationships, became destabilized. By the end of this phase, Montreal had entered a period in which isolation was both survival strategy and symptom of pervasive dread. Citizens lived in fragmented communities, each negotiating the unknown in private or semi-private spaces, while collective experience was mediated through rumor, anecdote, and selective observation. The shadows had not only disrupted physical reality but had reshaped social interaction, emotional response, and perceptual frameworks. Montreal, though still a functioning city, had become a landscape of heightened apprehension, where every corner, hallway, and alley carried potential significance, and where the boundaries between human agency and unseen influence were increasingly ambiguous. When winter began to wane, Montreal's streets slowly regained activity, yet the lingering effects of the shadow phenomena remained deeply embedded in the city's consciousness. Citizens emerged from their self-imposed isolation cautiously, their movements measured and wary. Families that had endured weeks of fear were reluctant to trust familiar routines, and the psychological imprint of the shadows persisted even where no direct encounters occurred. The city itself appeared changed, narrow alleys seemed darker than before, ordinary noises carried a weight of suspicion, and familiar buildings took on an almost uncanny quality. Montreal had survived the immediate crisis, but the collective memory of the shadows ensured that normality was fragile and provisional. Reports of active shadow sightings decreased, though they never vanished entirely. Some citizens claimed to feel their presence lingering at night, in empty rooms or quiet streets. Children continued to whisper of figures seen from the corner of the eye, and even adults confessed to occasional chills or sensations of being watched. The absence of overt manifestations did not dispel fear, rather, it solidified an uneasy awareness that the phenomenon had not been fully resolved. The shadows, though quieter, had left a psychological residue that altered perception, social behavior, and the city's sense of security. Communal life resumed gradually but cautiously. Shops reopened fully, schools extended hours, and public gatherings became more common. Yet a pervasive sense of restraint remained, visible in citizens' measured gestures and the careful way they navigated the streets. Conversations often returned to the events of the previous months, with stories recounted in subdued tones, sometimes with embellishment, sometimes with reverent fear. Rumor and folklore had merged with personal experience, creating a shared narrative that both explained and mystified the past events. Montreal's social cohesion, though restored in appearance, carried the subtle tension of collective trauma. The judicial and symbolic proceedings of the trial left an enduring mark. Though no tangible convictions occurred, the act of public confrontation had provided citizens with a structured outlet for anxiety and suspicion. Communities discussed the proceedings for months afterward, debating the credibility of witnesses, the plausibility of shadow agency, and the moral significance of the events. The trial had become a cultural touchstone, a story told and retold to make sense of what had happened. Even as life normalized, the memory of the courtroom, the testimony, and the objects associated with shadows persisted, forming a symbolic framework for understanding fear, accountability, and the limits of perception. Scholars and investigators who had visited the city left extensive notes, sketches, and theories, yet their findings offered no definitive answers. Reports were circulated in academic circles, fueling debates and publications far beyond Montreal itself. While some suggested psychological explanations, others left the phenomenon open-ended, emphasizing its resistance to rational categorization. The city had become a case study in uncertainty, an example of how fear, perception, and social dynamics could interact to produce events that challenged empirical understanding. Citizens were aware of these studies, and they contributed to a subtle pride in having endured the inexplicable, while also reinforcing the sense that something beyond human comprehension had touched their lives. Religious communities reflected on the events with a mixture of solemnity and caution. Clergy framed the experience as a collective trial of faith, emphasizing the importance of moral vigilance, communal responsibility, and spiritual awareness. Prayer services and ritual observances were extended, not in response to ongoing threat, but as a preventative measure and acknowledgement of what had occurred. These practices, though now routine, preserved the memory of the shadows and integrated them into the spiritual landscape of the city. For many, faith became both a source of solace and a lens through which the events were interpreted, giving meaning to experiences that otherwise defied comprehension. At the household level, the shadow's legacy remained deeply personal. Families continued to take precautions, and children were taught subtle lessons about vigilance and caution. Even those who had not experienced direct sightings reported heightened sensitivity to light, movement, and temperature. The ordinary rhythms of life were maintained, yet with an undercurrent of wariness that suggested the past months had permanently altered perception. Montreal's citizens had learned that fear could exist independently of physical evidence, and that the imagination, memory, and collective experience could shape reality in subtle, persistent ways. Despite the quieting of public alarm, folklore around the shadows intensified. Stories circulated of vanished individuals, of objects mysteriously displaced long after the main events, and of distant echoes of shadow encounters in nearby towns. These tales blended fact and speculation, creating a cultural memory that merged lived experience with narrative embellishment. Residents began to reference the phenomenon in everyday conversation, invoking shadows as cautionary figures, metaphors for unseen threats, and symbols of the city's collective resilience. The events had entered the social imagination, ensuring that the legacy of fear and fascination would endure for generations. Montreal's silence, following the intense months of activity, was more than absence of sight, it was a reflective quiet, a pause for contemplation, and a recognition that the city had been irrevocably altered. Streets and homes, though physically intact, carried the weight of what had transpired. The shadows had imposed an invisible architecture of fear, observation, and psychological tension that outlasted their visible manifestations. In this way, the city's calm was paradoxical, it was a peace marked by awareness, by memory, and by the subtle recognition that the unknown could return at any moment. In retrospect, the aftermath highlighted the interplay between fear, society, and perception. The shadows were less a tangible adversary than a catalyst for human behavior, social disruption, and collective introspection. Montreal's citizens had confronted the unknown not through force, but through endurance, testimony, ritual, and scholarly inquiry. Their experience demonstrated how communities navigate events that defy understanding, balancing hope, anxiety, and the human need for narrative. The city's silence was thus both an ending and a prelude, marking the conclusion of immediate terror while leaving a lingering, indelible imprint on the communal psyche. Even as Montreal settled into a fragile routine, the shadow phenomenon continued to provoke speculation, debate, and unease. Scholars, witnesses, and citizens alike struggled to reconcile their experiences with reason, each offering theories that attempted to explain what defied conventional understanding. Some adhered to psychological explanations, arguing that the shadows were manifestations of mass hysteria, collective stress, or prolonged winter isolation. They suggested that the city's pervasive anxiety created a feedback loop in which fear itself generated perceived phenomena. Witness accounts, they claimed, were shaped by expectation and imagination, reinforcing one another until the shadows seemed autonomous and intelligent. Other observers, particularly those grounded in natural science, proposed environmental or physical explanations. Variations in lighting, drafts through narrow alleys, or subtle reflections from windows and ice were cited as potential causes for some sightings. These explanations offered partial reassurance but could not account for the most persistent and dramatic reports, shadows appearing independently of light sources, moving against the natural flow of air, or interacting with objects in ways that defied known physical laws. Even the most rigorous experiments failed to fully replicate the phenomenon, leaving open the unsettling possibility that some unseen force remained at work. Folklorists and historians contributed another dimension to the discourse, situating the shadows within a continuum of cultural memory. They drew connections to past accounts of ghostly visitations, spectral watchers, and moralistic warnings embedded in urban folklore. From this perspective, the shadows were not necessarily objective entities but were encoded within the city's collective imagination, shaped by inherited stories, moral expectations, and societal anxieties. By invoking tradition, folklore provided both an explanatory framework and a cautionary narrative, emphasizing moral responsibility, vigilance, and the consequences of neglecting communal norms. Religious interpretations persisted, blending with scholarly debate in complex ways. Clergy suggested that the shadows were reminders of spiritual vulnerability, moral failings, or divine oversight. Their presence was framed as a test of conscience and faith, with the city's experiences serving as a symbolic reflection of human accountability. For believers, the question was not whether the shadows were real in a material sense, but whether they were morally and spiritually significant. This lens offered comfort and structure to a population still grappling with the unseen, reinforcing the idea that meaning could be derived even from incomprehensible events. Some theories were darker and more speculative. A few scholars and journalists proposed that the shadows might represent a previously unrecognized aspect of human perception, an ability to sense invisible energies or residual consciousness from past events. Others suggested the possibility of a malevolent intelligence manipulating perception, feeding on fear and social discord. These ideas were often dismissed in formal discourse but persisted in the margins, circulating in letters, conversations, and whispered accounts. The ambiguity of the phenomenon allowed a multiplicity of interpretations to coexist, none entirely satisfying, all compelling in their capacity to provoke both dread and curiosity. The trial, though symbolic, remained central to these discussions. Its legacy underscored the city's attempt to confront the phenomenon within established social and legal frameworks. Citizens debated the significance of testimony, the validity of evidence, and the psychological impact of public acknowledgement. Scholars analyzed how collective fear could be ritualized, codified, and managed through ceremony, even in the absence of a tangible defendant. The trial became a reference point, illustrating both the human desire for accountability and the limitations of conventional institutions when faced with phenomena that exist outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. Despite extensive observation, documentation, and debate, critical questions remained unanswered. What had caused the shadows to appear? Why did they target certain neighborhoods, homes, and individuals while leaving others seemingly unaffected? Were they independent agents, products of human imagination, or something in between? No single theory provided a comprehensive explanation, and the coexistence of multiple plausible but incomplete hypotheses underscored the enduring mystery. Montreal's citizens were left to navigate this uncertainty, balancing rational skepticism with the residual weight of experience. The phenomenon's legacy extended beyond explanation into social and psychological realms. Citizens who had witnessed or experienced shadows continued to navigate their environment with heightened awareness, alert to subtle movements, shifts in light, and changes in sound. Families adapted routines, educators adjusted teachings, and public authorities incorporated a sense of caution into urban management. The shadows had altered not only perception but behavior, leaving a lasting imprint on the city's culture, rituals, and social interactions. Their influence, though no longer overt, remained a subtle undercurrent, a reminder of what had been seen and felt, even when no longer directly present. Montreal's narrative became emblematic of broader human experiences with the unknown. The shadows demonstrated how communities respond to events that defy understanding, through observation, testimony, ritual, and speculation. They highlighted the interplay between fear, imagination, and collective memory, showing that even the most elusive phenomena can shape behavior, beliefs, and social cohesion. Scholars and citizens alike recognize that some mysteries resist resolution, yet the act of inquiry itself, whether through science, folklore, or moral interpretation, provides a framework for engagement and understanding. Ultimately, the shadows of Montreal remained unresolved, leaving a city changed in subtle but enduring ways. Streets, buildings, and homes retain traces of anxiety, vigilance, and memory. Stories of the events circulated for years, passed down through families and embedded in local folklore. Scholars continued to reference the phenomenon in discussions of perception, hysteria, and cultural memory. Citizens carried personal and collective impressions, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. In the final analysis, the shadows did not vanish entirely, they persisted as questions, as experiences, and as symbols of the limits of human knowledge and the resilience of communities in the face of the incomprehensible. Long after the shadows ceased their visible disturbances, Montreal continued to live with their imprint, both tangible and intangible. Streets once avoided regained traffic, homes once fortified returned to routine, and public spaces slowly filled with the bustle of normal life. Yet the memory of what had occurred lingered, woven into the city's culture, social behaviors, and psychological fabric. Citizens carried a quiet awareness that the shadows had existed, that fear could take form, and that even when the phenomenon receded, the lessons of vigilance, uncertainty, and collective response remained. The city's transformation was subtle but profound, marking a historical event that blended fear, social dynamics, and unresolved mystery into a lasting legacy. Stories of the shadows persisted in personal recollections and oral traditions. Families recounted experiences to subsequent generations, embellishing or interpreting events in ways that reflected both caution and fascination. Children learned of vanished figures, eerie sensations, and the trial that had never truly prosecuted a physical entity. These narratives became embedded in communal identity, a shared history of resilience, anxiety, and wonder. Montreal's citizens had witnessed the interplay between the tangible and intangible, and in retelling, they reinforced the boundaries between memory, perception, and imagination. The shadows became not just an event but a symbol of the city's confrontation with the unknown, a reference point for fear and the limits of human understanding. Historians and chroniclers studied the episode with both curiosity and rigor. Official records, newspaper clippings, personal diaries, and sketches of alleged shadow forms were preserved, forming a corpus of evidence that was at once fascinating and frustratingly incomplete. Scholars debated classifications: were the shadows psychological, spiritual, environmental, or a combination thereof? Their inquiries highlighted the limits of contemporary understanding, revealing the tension between empirical investigation and phenomena that resist conventional documentation. Even decades later, the events of 1912 Montreal were referenced in discussions of perception, social hysteria, and the ways human communities respond to fear that has no concrete form. The trial, often recounted with incredulity, became a cultural and psychological touchstone. Citizens remembered the courtroom filled with objects, sketches, and witnesses, a place where anxiety and imagination had been formalized into ritualized confrontation. Although no physical judgment was rendered, the act of public acknowledgement validated the city's collective experience and allowed for a temporary resolution of fear. The trial symbolized a human need to confront uncertainty, to codify experience, and to assert agency in situations where conventional tools fail. Its memory underscored the capacity of symbolic acts to influence perception, belief, and social cohesion, leaving an indelible mark on Montreal's cultural history. Psychologically, the episode transformed civic behavior. Individuals retained heightened awareness of their surroundings, and communities developed informal mechanisms for vigilance and support. Children, educated in caution, grew to perceive spaces and events with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Adults, having endured months of uncertainty, maintained practices designed to preserve security and predict potential threats. This persistent adaptation reflected the enduring influence of the shadows, not as a physical presence, but as a vector for learned vigilance, emotional sensitivity, and collective memory. Montreal had learned that the unseen could exert real effects on behavior, shaping society in subtle but enduring ways. Scholars and paranormal enthusiasts alike revisited the phenomenon repeatedly, contributing to a complex web of theory and interpretation. Some suggested that the shadows represented a confluence of environmental and psychological conditions, a form of mass perceptual anomaly triggered by isolation, stress, and social tension. Others proposed metaphysical or spiritual explanations, framing the city as a site of extraordinary occurrence, where unseen forces intersected with human consciousness. Each perspective offered partial insight, yet none could fully resolve the mystery, reinforcing the enduring allure and terror of the events. Montreal became both a laboratory and a legend, a place where human perception, collective anxiety, and the inexplicable intertwined. The shadow's legacy also influenced artistic and literary expression. Writers, painters, and poets referenced the events as metaphor and material, exploring themes of invisibility, fear, and the tension between seen and unseen. Urban landscapes were depicted with elongated shadows, empty streets, and the suggestion of unseen watchers. Narratives incorporated the psychological dimensions of isolation and communal anxiety, blending history, folklore, and imagination into works that resonated with the city's lived experience. The phenomenon transcended mere anecdote, entering the cultural imagination as both cautionary tale and source of artistic inspiration. Even in modern times, Montreal retains traces of its 1912 winter. Scholars of history, psychology, and folklore continue to analyze records and narratives, seeking patterns or insights into human behavior under duress. Citizens still recount stories of shadows, blending memory with mythology, emphasizing both moral lessons and the wonder of the inexplicable. The events have become a point of identity, a reminder that fear, perception, and imagination are intertwined, and that communities can endure, adapt, and find meaning even in the absence of resolution. Ultimately, the shadows of Montreal represent a convergence of fear, mystery, and resilience. They are remembered not for physical destruction, but for their capacity to challenge perception, unsettle communities, and leave lasting psychological and cultural effects. Montreal's experience demonstrates the interplay between human cognition, collective memory, and the unknown, illustrating how events that defy explanation can shape society in subtle yet profound ways. The city's streets, buildings, and social consciousness bear the imprint of that winter, a testament to the enduring power of the unseen. The legacy remains unresolved in its essence. The shadows were never fully explained, never fully understood, yet they have become immortalized in memory, scholarship, and culture. They continue to inhabit the margins of the city's imagination, a presence felt through stories, subtle rituals, and the enduring awareness that the unseen can exert influence. Montreal's confrontation with the shadows stands as both historical record and psychological case study, reminding future generations that some mysteries resist closure, and that the unknown, once encountered, shapes society, perception, and identity in ways that endure far beyond the events themselves.